Beyond Afghanistan, I think it's more important as we move forward to figure out what the conservative movement does and where we went wrong over the past decade. I'm sure you all have heard this quote before, but I started my chapter on foreign policy in my book with this quote, a quote of a certain former Southern governor. "We must be judicious in our use of the military. We will fight only when it is in the vital interest of the United States, when our mission is clear, and when the exit strategy is obvious." George W. Bush, 2000. We conservatives need to ask, why was it that the same cautious Republicans who resisted Bill Clinton's calls for military use in Bosnia, Kosovo, Haiti, Sudan, and Iraq adopt George W. Bush's preemption strategy without question? Why did so few conservatives criticize Mr. Bush's Wilsonian pronouncement that the United States of America would lead a global democratic revolution that would, his words, not mine, end tyranny on the globe? What exactly were we conservatives thinking during Mr. Bush's second inaugural address when the Republican president promised that U.S. troops would single-handedly export democracy and bring freedom and peace to all corners of the globe? And why did the same Republicans who quoted Colin Powell's doctrine to justify our restrained foreign policy approach in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president, why did those same conservatives attack Colin Powell in 2002 when he urged, before going into Iraq, that we adopt the same approach? You know, when we Republicans controlled the Armed Services Committee in the 1990s, we constantly lectured the Clinton administration on the need for showing more prudence and more restraint in our foreign policy. We saw Bill Clinton's use of military force as undisciplined and reckless, and as one Foreign Affairs article stated at the time, the Clinton cabinet seemed to view foreign policy as an extension of social work. We conservatives used our majority in Congress to attack that approach as unfocused, undisciplined, and Wilsonian. Now, for most conservatives, the Cold War was a necessary evil. U.S. global involvement was the only option available to contain the communist threat. But after the Soviet Union fell, Republicans I served with in Congress believed that the United States should engage in less military adventurism and narrow our focus abroad. We were so cautious when we would lecture the Clinton administration that Madeleine Albright, then Secretary of State, angrily accused GOP leaders of standing in the way of humanitarian missions that she wanted to run by military use. And she was right. We did stand in the way of it, and we were proud of it. No conservative I worked with on the Armed Services Committee in Congress was comfortable with Bill Clinton's eagerness to dispatch troops to Haiti, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo. We were especially troubled with the Balkans crisis, believing that the lessons of history taught us that you should never involve U.S. troops in a three-sided way civil war. Conservatives repeatedly pressed the Clinton administration officials that would come testify before our Armed Services Committee to state the overriding national interests that justified risking U.S. casualties. They never could. I think the closest we got was Al Gore saying that if we didn't send troops to the Balkans, if we didn't send troops to Kosovo, our credibility within NATO would be damaged. Obviously, those prudent concerns faded once the Democratic commander-in-chief left town and the Republican commander-in-chief came into power. We're not the world's 911, as we said in the 1990s, and we regularly admonished Clinton aides who repeatedly ignored our warnings of an overstretched military. And, you know, we always would lecture Clinton officials on what we consider to be the Magna Carta of conservative foreign policy. And that was the Weinberger Doctrine. And I think it bears repeating. Cap Weinberger, after Beirut, got together with people in the Defense Department, and he said, you know, we really need to narrow the focus of when we send U.S. troops abroad so we don't repeat the mistakes of Vietnam. We don't repeat the mistakes of Beirut. And he had a young Army man working with him, Colin Powell. And this is what they came up with. U.S. troops should only be deployed when, one, it is vital to U.S. national interests and our troop commitment is full and overwhelming. Two, the objectives for our troops are clearly defined. And three, leaders will be willing to constantly reassess troop levels. Four, Americans support the war before the engagement. And five, U.S. combat troops are sent in only as a last resort. You can apply those looking back, obviously, to some wars that we got involved with and to George W. Bush's policy pronouncements, especially during his second inaugural address. But I think more importantly for this conversation, we need to apply it to where we go in the future with Afghanistan. And I would like Barack Obama. I would like Harry Reid. I would like Nancy Pelosi. I'd like John Boehner. I'd like Mitch McConnell. I'd like Republicans and Democrats alike to tell me at this point in 2010 what is, quote, vital to U.S. national interests in Afghanistan. And after answering that question, I would like them to tell me, quote, what are the objectives for our troops? Our clearly defined objectives. And then, of course, what you brought up as well, most troubling. We've been in Afghanistan for 9 years. We still have not had a leader, Republican or Democrat alike, to tell us what's the end game? What's our exit strategy? What is the trigger? And this was always the key. Colin Powell said this was always the key to the Weinberger Doctrine. You never send troops in until you know what the trigger is to bring them home. And I've got to say, you look what George H.W. Bush did in the first Gulf War. He said, we're going to go and liberate Kuwait, and then we're going to bring our troops home. George H.W. Bush faced a torrent of criticism because after liberating Kuwait, he had generals that wanted to go up to Baghdad. He said no. The trigger was, our end game was liberating Kuwait. And he brought the troops home. He showed discipline. He avoided a lot of the mistakes that his son didn't avoid.